to this panel on romantic writers. I'm going to start with the introductions. So the first person over here is Walter Donway, and he read Atlas Shrugged in the summer of 1962 before heading off to Brown University, where he first met David Kelly, was an original trustee of this organization with David Kelly and George Walsh, introduced on the evening of David's speech in New York City, launching what was then the Institute of Objective Studies. He recently retired from the Atlas Society Board of Trustees after 20 years as a member. He was the editor of our first publication, the iOS Journal, and a contributor to all subsequent publications. Many of his articles and poems can be found on the Atlas Society website. After a career as a New York City Foundation executive subverting the liberal consensus, he retired early and began to write books. He's published 4 novels, 2 of poetry, a collection of stories and essays, and 2 memoirs of growing up in what he calls a vanishing New England. All are published under an imprint he created and assiduously promotes, Romantic Revolution Books. And Walter, how many are for sale out front?
Say a few.
2. But he has many for sale online, right?
Yeah, all of them.
Yes. Are they on Amazon?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. John Joseph Enright is a playwright and poet based in the Chicago area. His play, O'Brien and O'Brien, will be featured at the New York International Fringe Festival in August 2015. He shares a rhyme pretty much daily and sometimes other thoughts and he gives a website at Live Journal. But on Facebook also, he has a rhyme of the day, if you're interested. He also has several published books of poetry. Dale B. Halling, is a patent attorney in private practice with a BSEE, an MS in physics, and a JD. As a patent attorney, Halling has done work for Fortune 500 companies, startups, and individual inventors, protecting their inventions in the United States and around the world. Before that, Halling worked as an engineer on SDI and on test equipment. He is the author of The Decline and Fall of the American Entrepreneur, How Little-Known Laws and Regulations Are Killing Innovation. He and his wife, Kayla Halling, are co-authors of the novels Pendulum of Justice and Trails of Injustice. Dale B. Halling is a named inventor on 9 patents. And are your books for sale out front?
3 of them.
3 of them, okay. Vinay Kolhatkar studies screenwriting at NIDA Screenwriting, LA, and at the Story Department. He wrote Casting Impressions, a short film that was produced by King Creatives, and a TV pilot called And Justice for Some. His debut novel, The Frankenstein Candidate, was published by Lead Start Publishing. He is the founder, publisher, and chief editor of Savvy Street, an online site devoted to individualism and the art of living, where he is also a columnist. Formerly, he was the chief investment officer of a $5 billion fund invested internationally and the founding chairman of Great Energy Alliance Corporation. Vinny is a non-resident fellow at Contradictorio, a think tank that promotes individual and economic liberty. So we have them as a panel.
And one
here.
book. He wants his book mentioned.
Oh, and his books are for sale out front.
Yeah,
How
one.
many? One. Okay.
One book, many copies.
All right, so I'm going to start out with some questions for them, and then I'll open up to the floor, okay? So, for any of you, I don't know who you want to start. Who wants to start? Were Ayn Rand's works important and inspiring you to write novels?
Go ahead, Walter.
Are we working now?
I think
Yes.
It is working. You can hear it. Yes. Okay. Yes and no, which is always a good objectivist answer. Not in the same sense. I get interested in writing very, very early on. I think as early as the 4th grade. And by the time I was in high school, I was seriously writing. I was one of the editors of the school paper. I was writing stories. I was writing poetry. I won a significant poetry prize when I was in high school, and a prize awarded by no one less than Archibald MacLeish. And so I really had become committed to being a writer by then. So I finished high school, and in that summer, Atlas Shrugged came to our home. it's a whole story. It's been written elsewhere. And so I read that, and it made me more than ever want to be a writer, but it prevented me from being a writer for most of my life. I had been going quite strong. I got to Brown University. I took a course in fiction writing with John Hawkes, another well-known writer, not of the top rank, but very well-known. And in the first semester, I double-aced it. He loved my stories. I wrote about what I knew. I wrote about my childhood farm. I wrote about, animals and such. And then along came the Objectivist newsletter, I think with one of Ayn Rand's essays in it, like the goal of my writing or something. I said, oh my God, I'm a naturalist. What am I doing here? And I can't do this. And so the next semester I spent trying to write Romanticism in a very awkward way. And I remember John Hawkes at a private meeting saying, boy, you really, really disappointed me with this stuff. He said, you've got your hero, Ayn Rand, and you could be a real writer. And I started arguing with him about, naturalism, and it's so this and so that, and, about writing about bums. And he said, I can write a story about a bum that'll run circles around her novel. So we really got in quite a fight. I ended up at the door, and he was saying, you think you're Superman, you think you're Superman. So that was my introduction to Romanticism. I was still determined to write it, but the truth is I was so intimidated by Ayn Rand and Objectivism and the cult of Objectivism and whatnot that I just became blocked. And in fact, I didn't become unblocked in order to write my first novel until I was over 60. By then I'd had a whole career writing articles, 100 or more published. I'd written as a professional. I made a lot of money writing, fundraising writing. I became a top editor, but I couldn't do much fiction because I was just, I would start writing it and I'd kill off the first draft by comparing it to, real romanticism, and I just couldn't do it. So I think you asked, did reading Atlas Shrugged inspire you to become a writer? Yes, it inspired me.
That's a great question. Sorry to do the yes and no again, but I read Atlas Shrugged when I was 14, and it definitely inspired me, but it did not inspire me at the time to become a writer. I did do a little bit of writing in college, like a little skit. I'd call it a skit rather than a play, that sort of thing. And then I was involved in the financial industry. After the financial crisis, I kind of had an epiphany. Something's got to be done. The world's going, berserk. And I was talking to Will Thomas, and I was going to come to the Atlas seminar because I had a topic which was accepted, and it was called The Marketing of Objectivism. And in that I was arguing that, there's three different things. There's Objectivism, the philosophy. There's Rand, the persona, and her idiosyncrasies. And then there is the philosophy as portrayed in her fiction, and the three pillars are similar but not the same. And Will agreed with that, but in that I was going to suggest that the philosophy should be marketed as is, without the fiction, because that creates problems, and certainly without the Rand persona getting in the way. And he just calmly, we're talking on the phone, and he just gave me the numbers. And the numbers were Atlas Shrugged outsells everything else combined. Atlas Shrugged sells 7 million copies and blah, 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 and the numbers were staggering. He said ARI just sells Atlas Shrugged and Fountainhead. And that was kind of an epiphany, and I thought, the only way to change the world is to write fiction. And I originally got interested in writing, in doing screenwriting, because screenwriting is very hard on syntax. But it is easier in some ways. I did not have the confidence that I could write a novel, so I did screenwriting first, then I moved into fiction and novel writing.
I'm very disturbed by all these yes and no answers. Yes. No. So Rand was just kidding. Rand was the writer who had the single biggest impact on me. Before I read her aesthetic essays, I'd written a lot of poetry for myself, but I'd always puzzled over, well, how did you structure a story properly? I enjoyed reading stories a lot, and so her dicta about how a story should be structured, I found that fascinating, and that directly inspired me. Now, I take Walter's point. She's very hard to adopt, to be her disciple. It's kind of like you think you're going to be a sculptor, so let's see, I'm going to do just like Michelangelo, I'm going to do another David. Well, okay, you've taken on a horrible burden for yourself if you're trying to duplicate, somebody with a very distinctive vision and major accomplishment. I think you have to find your own voice eventually, or you're going to fail. You don't want to be just like Rand. It's a mistake. But I think right now, if she saw anything I was doing, I don't know what she'd think of it. But people who know Rand and look at my work, they see a tangential relationship at this point, I would say. Dale.
Thank you. So my wife was really the writer in the family. She was accepted to the Iowa Writers Workshop, and she decided to marry me instead. So she never got around to writing the novel, and we had kids and so on, and I wrote my nonfiction book, and one of my friends said, well, you're never going to get it out there unless you do like Rand and you write a fiction book which will illustrate it. And that kind of just got me going, that with other things that were going on in our life. Kyla and I plotted out a first novel which was going to be a huge sort of Clancy kind of novel, and said no. We had a lot of fun doing it, drinking wine and but so our first novel is very much an attempt to illustrate the points in my nonfiction book, and I think in the sense that I'm inspired by Rand in the sense that the overall point was to illustrate the points in my book, which I think both the nonfiction book and the fiction book illustrate objectivism in a very specific instance. They're not an attempt to, be the whole of objectivism. They're illustrating points in a more narrow sense.
Thanks. Walter, Ayn Rand said the most challenging and difficult aspect of writing a novel in the Romantic tradition is the plot. Do you find that to be true, and how do you deal with it?
Well, as I say, up until I retired, I don't know what was the most difficult part of writing a novel, because I couldn't seem to do it at all. It's not that I didn't try. I tried. I almost ruined my life trying. I was going to be a novelist, and I was blocked, and that was no reason not to do it. I mean, you got Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand was up here frightening me back from writing a novel, but she was behind me, shoving me ahead, saying, never give up on your creativity. So I was at the coal face, with a pickaxe this way, and the tractor was coming from behind me. I tried. When I was in my 20s, I wrote a novel. I did write a novel. But it was very, I did it in 2 weeks in a burst of, I'm just going to do it because I got to do it. But I didn't try to publish it. And then at I was 30, I wrote another novel, which is simply a piece of pornography, and I didn't try to publish that. So about the plot. Yes, when I was bucking away at trying to write and having a hard time, the hardest thing seemed to be to come up with a plot, to think of a plot. That's right. I thought I had to come up with an absolutely brilliant plot. I had read a lot. Nothing seemed like it was very new. So I just didn't. I did that one time, that book when I was 20, but after that I couldn't seem to do it. So I guess that is part of what stopped me. So maybe that is the hardest. After I retired and began to write, nothing was hard. And I've written 10 books since, and it's been mostly a pleasure of flow. So.
Vinny?
I might be the exception here, but I disagree that plot's the hardest. I would have agreed a couple of years ago, or maybe most certainly 5 years ago, because originally to start writing fiction, the plot was the hardest piece. But I didn't find other things easy. I hadn't written fiction ever, more or less leaving the small bits I had done. I had started out with English as a second language. It became first. So for me, there were other obstacles than plot. But when I was learning screenwriting for several years, I went to many screenwriting courses. I absorbed a lot of the screenwriting theory in my own way. And the one thing that struck me, and I have read many a screenwriting book, was they always start with, if this is your outline, here's how you improve it. And just about nobody ever talked about how do you come up with the plot outline in the first place. And I worked on that question myself for a long time, and I think I've got a methodology to come up with a plot outline, because I've got many more than a dozen plot outlines sitting at home, and I think I could generate more plots than I could ever do justice to in an entire lifetime. Which is what my workshop tomorrow is all about, is a workshop in story plotting. For those who attend it, you might be amazed at how quickly you come up with a one-page story outline in 2 hours. And by no means is that a complete plot, and it might take you 6 months to really get a good, tight plot. So I guess if you want a 10 out of 10 plot, it might take years. If you want a decent plot outline, I think it's no longer, for me, it's no longer the hardest thing. There are other aspects, the sense of drama, the characterization, the language. For me, those things are a lot easier than they used to be, but probably the plot is now a lot easier.
I don't know what the hardest part is for me or for other people. A lot of people in theater, certainly, there's a tremendous problem. I think she mentions it in one of her books, where you can write a good first act, but then writing a second act that actually finishes the first act is hard. When I'm working on writing a play, I'm usually focused on, can I actually wrap this darn thing up in 90 minutes? I've got an idea, I've got an interesting idea to start with. How can I wrap it up? I know vaguely where I want to go, but what happens next? In theater, there's a particular demand that it not be boring at all. Kind of when you're writing a novel, you can kind of have, here's a boring passage. Oh, this guy fell asleep here. I'm going to skip ahead when you're looking at a novel. If you lose the audience in theater, they literally fall asleep on you. They don't jump 3 pages ahead to get past this description. So I think it's generally true what she wrote. But I mean, there's people who have sort of well-done stories where all the characters are you don't like any of the characters at all. And so all the other parts are important too, is all I'm going to say.
The hardest part is proofreading, and we suck at it. We've paid for 4 edits in both novels, and people still come back. So, I mean, it's not like we're skipping here, but that is the hardest. This, from my perspective, not being an arts-oriented person per se, point of view took a long time to get used to, and writing fiction as opposed to writing nonfiction. Plot to me in many ways is I write patents, so it's sort of technical writing. How do you explain? Everything has to connect. And plot to me is that way, and if I get stuck in a patent, I kind of say, well, how would I do this? Technically, I'm writing what the inventor wrote or invented, but a lot of times he doesn't tell me what he invented completely, and so I say, well, okay, this is probably what you'd have to do here. So I spend a lot of time, and that to me is the way I connect the dots. The plot is very much the same, but point of view, if you don't write fiction, it's a major change to me.
Ayn Rand said the most challenging and difficult aspect of writing a novel, when asked what is the goal of your writing, Ayn Rand answered, to create the ideal man. How would you answer that question?
I can't say that the goal of my writing is to create the ideal man. If I still believed that, I probably wouldn't have produced anything by now, because that was all part of the hang-up. So the goal of my fiction writing, for many years, it was to get a book written. That was get something written. I think the goal of my writing is to enjoy the story myself as I go along. That certainly is one goal. I've written very, very different kinds of novels in a way, different genres and different approaches. I can't say that I was guided by some dominating a goal, just that I wanted to get these books written, and I found something interested in me, and I got started. I never outline my novels ahead or plot them ahead or anything like that. I haven't done that at all. I just start writing from the first idea, and it just seems to come okay. And I go back and tinker when I have to. So no overriding, overwhelming goal, and yet I just love now the very process of writing. There's no block attached. There's no anguish attached. It just flows.
For me, the goal of my writing is to create the ideal awakening. The subtitle of my first novel is A Woman Awakens to a Web of Deceit. My second novel is focused on a man who awakens to the kind of premises he holds. And neither of them are ideal. They're far from ideal, but they change and improve through the course of the novel. And my, in fact, biggest disappointment in Atlas Shrugged is the character of John Galt. I don't think he lifts off the page, to be honest. My favorite characters, I was 14, were Francisco. I wanted to be like him because he seemed to be really happy and real. And I loved Dagny. She was real. And in The Fountainhead, I absolutely loved the character of Gail Winan with all his difficulties because he seemed more real. He wasn't ideal, but he seemed more real. So if anything, I don't want to create an ideal person even at the end of it, but someone who is vastly changed and improved and has awakened. And there are a few stories in films as well. There are not too many that show the kind of profound metamorphosis of a person. And I think that's a challenging task, and I love putting myself up to that challenge.
What motivates me is usually a strange sense I have to get something out. But what I think of, what I'm looking at it, is I want to write something usually funny and interesting.
Yeah, so if you look at the overall, we're writing a series, and if you look at the overall, the main thing we'd like to illustrate, and this just comes from, my work life, is the amazing creativity and heroicness of people, and they're everywhere when you live in a relatively free society, and the amazing evil and vindictiveness of people who don't live in a free society.
Would you classify your writing as popular romanticism, like in a genre of science fiction, detective novels, romance novels, or do you aspire to be part of romantic literature?
That's the subject of my talk tomorrow. How Ayn Rand resuscitated actually a dead romantic movement after almost a century after it died. Well, no, 2/3 of a century, and did it by transforming it into romantic realism and then writing a great, great literary novel. I don't consider my novels, well, one of them is, which is called The Way the Wind Blew, which I wrote in my 20s, that book I wrote then, but which I went over completely and rewrote and replotted more recently. That's a detective story. And then The Lally Worm is a kidnap, revenge kind of thriller. So that is certainly not what I would call literary romanticism. and then I wrote one called "Oh Human Child," and maybe that comes more closer. But it's a fantasy. It's a fantasy. It has elves in it. Has the most erotic, dirty elves you ever saw, but they're still elves. And so I wrote that. I think that might be as close as I come to a literary work. And then there was The Price of Hannah Blake, and that is a Victorian romance novel, my favorite. I think it's got the best plot. I think it's got the most fascinating character who develops the most in all ways. I think it's got a great historical setting, but I still think it probably has to be categorized as a erotic romance.
There was something that Ayn Rand said, which I 100% agree with, and you have to agree with it when you try it. She said, when you write, your subconscious will reveal itself. And it's actually even more than that. You have no choice but for your subconscious to reveal itself. You cannot write what isn't in your subconscious. You simply cannot. And when you realize that, this whole question becomes very easy to solve in one sense, because you kind of go, well, the sort of popular literature, like the detective fiction kind of thing, sells more, and the literary parts sell less. Therefore, maybe I should make more money by trying to do that. But if your body and your mind won't let you, you basically have no choice. So we need to clarify what we mean by literary, because the word literary evokes images of, James Joyce and that kind of 78-word sentence, which is kind of grammatically correct if you can put it all in your head. But that's not what we mean. We mean by that. We mean the moral conflict at a much higher level than at what is in detective fiction, which is just simply cops and robbers. So you all know which is the good side and the bad side. And so for me, yes, it is. I aspire to Romanticist literature because I want to write about grave, profound moral conflicts. And otherwise, I wouldn't be able to write.
Well, lately, I've been writing romantic comedies, so I guess romantic sounds like it's romanticist. My hero, in a certain way, on this would be Terence Rattigan. He writes very restrainedly in certain ways. He doesn't load his books up with philosophical discussions, certainly, but his characters emerge with a type of profundity anyway. So I don't know that I've achieved his level, but he's certainly my hero on this. And is he writing literary plays? You could argue about that, but I think he was. So I'm just going to stand with Terence.
So I think our books are definitely thrillers. So I think broadly they're in the romantic tradition. They are not. It's like so many thrillers. The hero is not someone who was in the CIA or the FBI or the Navy SEAL, and the bad guys are so far not terrorists, and it doesn't revolve around the ability to beat people up. It revolves around the idea of being able to outthink them, and that's one of the things we want to illustrate to some extent is that the thinking part here is more important. But we're not trying to write literary novels. I mean, I want you to pick it up and feel like you're reading a James Bond or a Thomas Clancy or a Crichton.
I'd like to open it up to the audience. Do you have any questions?
I'm by no means a writer, but I read things about writing. And very frequently in recent times, I've read a lot about, I could do that. Thank you. Many writers say that they have a schedule, like they write every morning at a certain time, or they have to sit at a certain desk or something like that. And I was just curious if you all have a pattern that you follow, or because I know all of you do lots of other things as well. So do you write every day, or I have to write 2,000 words before I can stop for the day, or something like that?
I guess I'm first again. When I was trying to write so hard for several decades, I worshiped the idea of schedule because it seemed like that is what would solve my problem, because I would sit down every day to write, no matter whether I wanted to or not, and therefore, eventually I would, because I'd keep to my schedule. I read wonderful books about schedules that writers have kept. It's a whole legend about schedules. But in the end, I could not keep to a schedule because it was too hard to get to that desk and face the awful emptiness. So I really didn't keep to a schedule. Now with my other writing, the writing I did to make a living, and articles, I didn't need a schedule because I spent all my time doing that. And it was my default position. If I was doing something else, it was to get back to that. When I retired and began to write my novels, I don't have a schedule because, again, it's just about all the time. As Vinay can attest about my productivity for Savvy Street, which isn't even fiction, I just don't seem to be able to stop writing, never mind get going.
I don't have a schedule either. I tend to write in bursts, and I've sometimes written 3,000 words in a single evening, and I think, oh wow, if I could do that every day, wouldn't that be great? But then sometimes there's 2 weeks of nothing, and proofreading and editing and researching, and I spend an enormous amount of time thinking through the next scene and how it would affect the consequential scenes. So when I've done all the thinking and the researching, and then I start to sit down to write, it just flows. So there is that burst after the research, and then there's proofreading and editing, and then another bit of research, and then there's another burst. So it is a schedule, but it isn't the number of words per day kind of schedule.
Usually I write on Saturday or Sunday. I tend to make notes at lunch on work days.
I never keep a sort of daily schedule or so many words, and this is a source of conflict occasionally between me and my co-partner. I'm more the slave driver. She's the creative one. But I have like an overall schedule once I start a project, and I'm like, I'd like this part to be done, or the whole thing to be done by then. Means we have to do so much here and there, and I realize it'll be in bursts, fits and bursts, partly because I've got other things going, and partly because sometimes it flows better. One thing, my wife studied under David Morrell, who wrote the book that was the basis of Rambo.
First Blood.
First Blood is actually a very good book. It's different than that. He has an idea. If you have an interest in writing, he has a book about writing. But one of the things he said, if you are having writer's block, which I used in the last book, which I thought was quite useful, is he says he just gets on the computer and he has a conversation with himself. He says, David, why are you blocked? And he says, well, I'm blocked because of this. And he keeps these notes. And I actually tried that when I had some plot things that I was working through. I thought that was actually very helpful.
Writers famously start with events from real life or very close to real life and then modify it to get to their fiction. Others, and I find myself preferring this from the standpoint of creativity, think about underlying it, may create a character and then flesh it out in a way that seems psychologically plausible and so forth. And I've thought about this as a metaphor as making potato soup, either in the first case by taking a large chunk of potato and putting a little liquid around it, and in the other case is having almost a puree where you might take small events from your life and incorporate it in a different way. How do you approach?
No, I don't think I start with something like that. I was always taught write what you know, start with what you know. And I think in many ways, especially a writer's first novel, in some ways is always autobiographical, some directly and some more remotely. But that's not where I start now. To tell you the truth, I really got going all of my impetus and energy then and now comes from erotic fantasies. And the first writing I did when I was retired was all about writing, erotica for various online sites, just pure, I think very imaginative erotica. Probably one of the better, being a professional writer from all my life, probably one of the better stylists in this area, which is not known for its elegant style. So the first, really, at least, I think the first book I wrote when I retired, remember, I don't know, I had written 2 books before, but done nothing with them. The first book I wrote when I retired was called The Lally Worm, and it began, in fact, I was writing, another piece of erotica, and I thought I'd read a couple chapters about a woman who was kidnapped and put in a dungeon, and all that. And I wrote it, and the more I wrote about her captivity, the more I got into the psychology of it, and thinking about how she would endure it and how she would, what happens to you. And I thought about Hannah Arendt's description of the 5 stages by which the concentration camp people were broken down to utter slavery. The 5 stages: first the political man, and then keep going, and finally break down the ethical man, and break down next and next. And I started all that. So by the time I finished 2 chapters, I was liked my character enough. Carolyn Brecher, I liked her enough, so I didn't want to leave her in the dungeon, and I got her out, and I just kept writing and wrote a full-length novel called The Lally Worm. So I did get into it, directly through erotica then, I guess. But I think you can't make up something that doesn't exist or that you don't know about or you haven't experienced in some way. You just can't. There isn't anything in your mind but what's been there in recombinations. So I think if you go through my novels, you'll find all kinds of references to things in my life. It's a little like dreams. If you analyze your dreams, you find out that in a strange way, a lot of the stuff that happened that day appears in the dream, but it's been utterly transformed.
So, I was going to say Walter's erotica fantasy lends new meaning to your subconscious will reveal itself. But I think that's a plot versus character is a false dichotomy. Sid Field, a screenwriting teacher, says, a character is what character does. And at first it confused me, but Rand says the same thing. A plot is a character in action. So to start, in a story, you can't start with just a character. You got to have a character and a desire or a goal. And there's many ways to start, as Rand says herself in The Art of Writing Fiction. You can start with a theme, you can start with a climax, you can start with, ideally, a bunch of characters who conflict with each other rather than one, or a character and a desire which is difficult to achieve. I go through that actually. If you see your workshop notes in this white binder, I've kind of got all sorts of starting points, log lines, and so there is no, in the end you got to have a complete salad. So whether you first start chopping the cucumbers or first start chopping the tomatoes, it doesn't matter. In the end you got to have this whole thing that sits together.
Yeah, I tend to start with a situation, but the situation involves at least a couple of characters and a problem between them. And that sort of implies who the characters are, because any problem they have is going to be based on who they are. I mean, what you think is a problem, except for maybe starving to death, everyone has different ideas of what their problems are. And I tend to write about first world problems usually. Like can I keep my job? Can I keep my wife? Those kinds of questions. Not am I about to die, which I think of as a third or second world problem. But I do think the point that you you bring your own mind to it. All the characters you dream up are ultimately people that you've got stored in your head in some form. They're not necessarily you exactly, but there's something you've abstracted or internalized somehow, because, Rand talks about this, is that when you're writing dialogue and action, usually you're just kind of taking dictation. The experiences of one of taking dictation at a certain point. I mean, not when you hit the blocks, and the blocks are very important, but where most of the work is taking place, it's kind of coming to you, strangely enough. And you're sitting there, and this character says that, and this character says the other thing. And it's a very strange process, but somehow it's coming up from your mind, so somehow a lot of it's autobiographical in the end.
Yeah, the plot is something, it's a conflict, it's something going on in the world today, in our case, that we want to illustrate, and that is, I wouldn't say it's created out of a whole cloth, it's something that's out there that exists, we'd like people to wake up about. But the background is extensively researched in our case, and certainly we used, we used both many inventors and inventions that I've run into over the years, because ours tend to be very technical, and the characters we've looked at more in the first book than the second book. We looked to people, so we had some sort of image and said, well, this is where that character comes from. So ours are very factual and in the background.
You often hear actors and actresses say that they never have seen the movie that they were in. So the question for you as writers, do you go back at some point and reread your story after it's been published? And you can either be honest or lie creatively. What did you think of it?
I was going to finish my last sentence by giving you my standard apologia. It's a line from the last great Romantic poet and the greatest poet of the 20th century, who said, "You think it wrong that lust and rage attend upon my old age. What have I to spur me into song?" All right, so that ends that one. Now I go back and read I go over them many, many times. The part of writing I like best is editing, because I am a poet, and all poetry is about editing until every single word shines as brightly as possible in every context. And that's the way I tend to write. I write very fast, but then I will write, say, a chapter or two chapters, and then the next day, before the third chapter, I write everything I've written so far, and then I write third chapter. And often I keep doing that, although I don't go from the start, but I go back a couple chapters. I really like reading my own work a lot, and I love editing it and polishing it. Going back on the novels, I do it quite a lot. Ayn Rand did too. She said she always loved to pick up Atlas Shrugged in a given time and loved to go back and read a given passage again and again, and she just said she did that a great deal. I'm not comparing myself in any way, but I do go back, and I have been, so far, I'm pretty happy with what I've written. It really says what I meant to say in the way I meant to say it.
To answer your question of change, I have done that on my debut novel. I published it, I went back, I read it, and the parts that I didn't like, I actually went and changed it. I changed the ending as well, and I republished it. But I certainly do not want to make that a habit. I tend now to go over things as they're being written quite extensively, and I do like to read, but I do find one strange thing, that I always end up in one of two spots when I sometimes reread what I've written. And I know both those spots are unrealistic, but I either think it is complete shit, or I think it is absolute heaven, and it's nothing is better has been ever written or something like that, And I know neither of them is true. and I just have to get over that feeling and say, no, okay, just be objective about it. It's neither one of those extremes. So it really helps me enormously. And I didn't have that advantage in my first novel, to have some beta readers walk with me. And I'm very, very happy that on my second novel I have got, in fact, 2 beta readers, one of whom is here today in this room, and is kind of a professional literary agent, and the other one's a friend of mine, but she gives very honest feedback, and she's a layperson. So, and those 2 then, like kind of milestones of honest feedback, because my mind always goes one end or the other. It thinks it's complete rubbish, or it thinks it's great.
I'm going to talk about plays, not novels. If you sit in the back of the theater and watch the audience react to, especially a comedy, say, if there's a dead moment, you feel it, and it hurts. But if there's a live moment, you feel it, and it's really good. So yes, I have sat through these things repeatedly, and I enjoy the parts where the audience likes it, and I hurt when the audience loses it.
Well, we've only written 2 novels, and so we haven't had a lot of time, but they are a series, so I've gone back and read parts because I have to be consistent with the other parts after. I mean, you read your book a million times before it's published, and then you find out you should have read it a couple more times for proofreading. But as far as you read it a million times, and sometimes you're so close to it that you just it doesn't matter whether it's any good or not. You're just grinding through it, and sometimes you read through it and you can. Your mind is open. You can go, this part is bad. What we have actually found very helpful, and we didn't do as well in the second book as a process thing, is that we read it out loud to each other. And that really helps give a sense that just reading it to yourself does not give. And especially if someone else is reading it to you or vice versa, you pick up on things that you just won't otherwise pick up on. But as far as rereading, the one just got published. It's not even out in hard copy yet, so I haven't reread that one yet. The other one has been out for about 1.5 years, 2 years, and it's either because I'm writing the next book or because somebody has written me and said, I like this section, or what about this section or something, and then I've reread that section. Yeah.
When you're writing, do you ever have a character kind of take over your world you're creating and twist your plot off somewhere you didn't want to go, and have you yielded to the character instead of the plot?
That's a good question, and it's a question very often asked, and there are many writers who assert that, although Nabokov was asked that, and he said, absolutely not. They do exactly what I tell them to do, the little slaves. My characters do tend to take off. Maybe, my writing's easy and it flows. I enjoy it. I love to see where it's going. So yes, I think in a way the character, you see, that's not exactly the way it works. This is the way it works. When I start writing, the page is blank, and I can put down anything on earth on that page. There's nothing to prevent me from anything. But when I have written a page, suddenly my choices are hugely down. Let's suppose I start writing The Lally Worm, and I got the page. Again, I can write anything in the world, but then once I've got Carolyn Brecher driving from New York to East Hampton with her cat in the back and looking forward to her weekend home and thinking about how she's happy that her career as a lawyer has enabled her to get a country house, all of this in the first page or so. Well, once I've written that, there's a huge funnel. What I can write next is extremely narrowed down now in the world to anything. It's all got to be consistent. It's got to be Carol Brecher. It's got to be now. It's got to be East Hampton. It's got to be lawyer. And by the time I got a chapter or two, so much has been said that you're extremely limited. As you go along, that funnel narrows and narrows and narrows. You got the whole plot. You've got her personality, other personalities, plot threads. It gets narrower, and if the logic is lodged in your mind, yes, it seems to take off because the choices and what has to happen next become obvious because you're really, in a good sense, locked yourself into the plot. If it's a good plot, it's logical, and the next step's got to be, you've got this much logic, you're very likely to know what the next premise is. That's why it takes off.
I wouldn't do that consciously, but it can happen. It has happened once to me on a short screenplay. It was in Australia. It was a national film scriptwriting competition, and I was in the final. And I ended up, as a result of that, finding a producer and a director, and they loved it enough to want to make the film, which is a short film, and they did. But the producer, who was a lady, kept saying, I don't like this main character, because it was about a call girl who wants to change her life, and she finds the right approach by seducing the wrong client through a misunderstanding. And she wasn't empathetic, and she kept insisting that people just don't like her, so you got to change her. And eventually I yielded, and I'm kind of happy for it, because that's the first time I was sort of able to collaborate with a lot of people. There was a director, and there were actors who were improvising their lines, and all of a sudden we would find a terrific piece of dialogue because they improvised their lines, and we said, oh, why, that works. And it was funny, and so we just changed the script. And I ended up writing 2 endings then, and said, take which one you want, and they filmed both.
Yeah, I sort of don't know any way to write except by letting the characters take off on their own. Maybe I don't plan it out enough, but I'm sitting there and I'm trying, I've got 2 characters talking, and I don't necessarily know exactly who they are yet. They have to kind of define themselves as I go, and they just say things, and I've got an idea of where I want them to end up, but they have their own ideas about where they want to end up too, and sometimes they don't end up exactly where I thought they should go. So I kind of struggle with that, trying to beat my slaves into shape, Walter. But usually I can get them someplace close to where I wanted to go, but they don't usually go exactly where I thought they would end up.
Yeah, there's all sort of erotic jokes about beating slaves into place, but we'll ignore those.
Oh, sure, go there.
I would say we have a pretty well-defined plot. We have a major character that's going to go throughout all our books. So the character is no character is going to take off, but being true to a character, in fact, a lot of people have pointed out, a lot of times writers have writer's block because they're trying to get their character to do something that's not consistent with who the character really is. Right. And I've found that happens to us.
That's right. Yeah, it's really logic getting in your way. You don't realize that. Why can't I write this? But there's an internal logic conflict. The character just wouldn't do what you think the character should do.
Exactly, yeah.
Someone defined writing as a machine for making choices. And in some ways that's what it is, because the more choices you make, the narrower the scope of the possible choices you can make.
For the future, yeah.
And so does the ending become easy or hard? Why do I have to write this? I've already thought it all through, but now I have to write this darn thing. Go ahead.
The ending becomes easy because all the logic is there, and all of the threads and the logic should just about dictate the ending. If it does and you don't like the ending, you're kind of in deep poo-poo because you've written a whole book that gets you there. So that might be difficult. But if you've liked what you've developed so far, the ending ought to fall into place pretty well. Although interestingly enough, I wrote a ending to The Lally Worm. I first wrote it on a website called Literotica, and people followed it week after week, chapter after chapter. And when I ended it with the heroine tragically being killed, they're absolutely outraged. The outrage was amazing. I realized that if I published this novel, this was not going to be the way to make it go. So I had to go back about a third of the way and changed some of the logic and changed some of what happened. And I had also had her boyfriend killed off in Mexico. They said, "Oh my God, you can't." So I get him back to life, and I had her killed off, and I got her back. So I changed it considerably, but in order to do it, I had to go back and change at least the last third of the book for the logic.
Well, each of you is very different from the other, yet you're all working within the same romantic realist, which I hope will become a tradition. How would you like to be seen in the future as a writer, based on your work? And also, what patrimony do you have for other writers? What are you offering the writers who are coming in the future?
Patrimony, you said?
Patrimony.
Yeah. I suppose because I'm an admirer of Ayn Rand, I'm in the romantic realist tradition, except I don't see my books as romantic realism. As I said, they're what Ayn Rand distinctly called popular romanticism. I don't, to my knowledge, no romantic realist novel has been written since Ayn Rand. Not that I know of. I see in Vinay's work and in Dale's work, they're both, they're youngish writers. I see a lot of promise of it, but I haven't seen romantic realism written. What do I want people to think? Part of the reason that my block finally went away is I stopped caring. Actually, that was a big part of the reason my block went away. I stopped caring what people thought of it so much. I wanted them to like the books, but I didn't have to be them approve, my morality or anything like that. So, legacy, I don't. Patrimony, I don't think I'm batting in the patrimony league right now. There might be something that writers get from me, but I doubt it will be anything they can't get from a lot of other people.
You are so modest, Walter.
Well-deserved modesty. No, I really don't. I can't go here now, but I feel very differently about my poetry. I feel my poetry is serious, extremely serious. I feel it's, in some ways, some of the best poetry written today, and that it's, and it's an attempt to revive the great tradition in poetry. And I've written introductions to talk about the role it could play in reviving it. Barbara Brandon said, I'd given up on modern poetry until I saw yours. And, I think you're the first writer that went back to the great tradition. I'm not sure that's true, but I do feel differently about my poetry, not so much the novels.
Okay, good. Some modesty. Thank you.
Yeah.
I guess it's a tough question, but maybe there would be a time, sometime in the future, whenever that is 10 years down the track, I hope to be able to look back and say, there were a bunch of novels that at least some people found both thrilling but also kind of inspiring thinking, and it's tackling the big issues of the day in terms of concretizing the abstraction. And the most of all, I'd like to be remembered for creating certain awakening within a man and within a woman, within a child for that matter, of human change, of redemption, of awakening, of striving towards moral virtue in the guise of a thrilling story, in the realm of a thrilling story, I'd rather say. That's sort of what I'd like to be remembered as. Whether I achieve it or not, I guess if we sit around again in 10 years' time, I don't know what the judgment would be.
I usually try not to worry about how I'll be remembered. I did want to say, Walter, it's funny, you're talking about you decided not to care, but when everybody hated the ending of Lollyworm, you changed it. No, I only have read the new version, which I liked a lot. I'm glad you kept that girl alive. I liked her.
I changed it, for marketing reasons, not so much for any opprobrium delivered down on my head. I changed it for marketing reasons. I said, boy, I've got a real loser here. It's documented, and now I have a chance to change it, so I did.
Well, but, I mean, let me ask you a question. You must have felt in some sense that the people, did you feel the people were right? You went ahead and changed it.
The ending I had fit with my sense of life best, which tends to be, at best, a sense of struggle and often tending toward, tragic endings and such. I have a much easier time responding from my depth of my sense of life to a tragic ending than I do to an heroic ending. So I had a tragic ending on the book, and that really fit my sense of life. But interesting thing was, I realized people wanted not a tragic ending, and when I wrote the non-tragic ending, I realized it fit the novel better, it worked better, it really was where it was going, that I had built up Carolyn Breccia not to be defeated, and that it was my sense of life that was marching her off to execution, and in effect it was against the thrust of the book. And I think that's why partly why the readers didn't like it, because it had been built up that she was going to survive, and then I had gone and pulled a switcheroo on her. So in that sense, it's an interesting case study of sense of life and readers and what happens.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, interesting question. I'm glad you kept her alive, although we have some characters who people have asked us to keep alive. In fact, I think there was one you were quite disappointed died.
Are you doing a George Martin thing where you're killing everybody?
No. But the logic, I think, would never have worked if this character was kept alive. Bottom line is, if I had my dream as to what we're accomplishing, we're not writing this incredible, beautiful prose that Walter writes. Our goal of some sense would be to have an iconic character. The main character, we're trying very hard to make it, sort of an iconic character, not a somebody who just sort of is around. And it's sort of a thinking man's James Bond or Robin Hood. And in many senses, our stories are modern-day Robin Hood stories.
Thank you. That's all the time we have. Thank you.